well, we're going to talk about it largely in higher education, but it's probably obvious to you all that this is an issue that doesn't just affect higher education, it affects all sorts of other sorts of work, so the banking sector, the media sector, the list sort of goes on and on. Areas where certain groups are not as well represented in that sector as they are in the general population. And the question is, the sort of perennial question around this is why that's the case. Why it's the case and what we can do about it. And we're going to talk today, about two phenomena, two psychological mechanisms, essentially, things that are sort of go on in our brain that may be partially responsible for it. Okay, so the first sort of caveat to say is what we're going to say today is not at all supposed to tell you everything that's responsible for it. But these are two things that a number of people have thought may well be responsible for the sorts of underrepresentations that we see. And what's sort of good about these mechanisms, in some sense not good in their effects, but is that you can make changes to override them and hopefully overcome the effects of the underrepresentation and get better representation really quite easily. And we'll go on and talk about that at the end. So the first part of the talk, we're going to talk about these mechanisms. One one's called implicit bias, the other one's called stereotype threat. And then at the end of the talk, we're going to be interested in what we can do to combat them. And if we can try to combat them, then the hope is that you might get better representation. So the thing to note throughout is that this is not supposed to be the sole cause of the underrepresentation we're going to talk about. Okay, so what is the problem? So, like I said, we're going to talk largely about higher education or academia. And we're also going to talk in the main about the representation of women, but as we'll see, there's the effects of these mechanisms we're going to talk about is on minority groups as well, so ethnic minority groups, disabled people, and other groups which we'll talk about later on. Okay, so here's the sort of striking statistics. First one, sorry, somebody's skyping, so I'm just making sure you can see the whole screen. So the first thing is that in higher education in the UK, only just over a fifth of the professors are women. In academia in general, so not just at the professor level, but at other levels as well, and also across other subjects, 38% are women, whereas the population is roughly 50%. And like I said, we're going to talk largely about women and representation of women in academia in this session, but you can see that the situation is equally bad, or in fact a lot worse, in the case of black people and disabled people. So black people, 1% of all people with permanent jobs in UK academia are black, but in the population the number is 3.5%, and 3% of people have declared disabilities in academia, but 18% of the population. So that's the sort of underrepresentation we're talking about. A notable thing, one thing you might be thinking when we talk about this, particularly if you're undergraduates, you might think, well, I don't really see how that could possibly be the case. I go into my lectures and it's sort of half women, half men. How can this be? And that's certainly true. In fact, if you look at the proportion of women who are undergraduates in philosophy, it's just a little bit below 50%. So not exactly at the level of the population, but not very far off. But as you can see from this, the numbers decrease all the way up until the lowest level at professor, where it's just over 20%. Okay, so the question is, why is this? What is going on that is excluding women from philosophy at the postgraduate level and then gradually up the ranks of the academic scale? Okay, so we're going to talk about these two mechanisms, implicit bias and stereotype threat. And although we're applying to this particular area, the lessons from it are very broad. So they're both cognitive processes. They're often unconscious. And they influence the judgments and ways that we evaluate people, essentially. So both of them have their roots in associations that we make between particular membership of a group and a person's ability at a particular task. Okay? So these are unconscious associations that we make between whether someone belongs to a particular group and whether they'll be competent at a particular task. They're essentially stereotypes that we have in our mind that associate these. So in implicit bias, what happens? In implicit bias, what happens is these mechanisms mean that I wrongly evaluate someone else at performing a particular task in question. Okay, so suppose I'm trying to decide whether a particular applicant for a job in front of me is competent to do the job. And suppose that that person belongs to a group that I associate unconsciously in my mind with not being competent at that particular job. Then I'm going to evaluate that person's ability to do the job less well than perhaps the evidence in front of me justifies. And that's not because perhaps I've consciously decided, oh, I think that person's hopeless at it, but rather because unconscious mechanisms have kicked in, and because of the unconscious association I have between people in that particular group and a lack of competence at this particular task, I evaluate them as not being very good. So the standard sorts of ones that people, the sorts of biases that people have are that women wouldn't be good as pilots, or that gay men wouldn't be good as childminders. So these are associations, so these are particular groups, a group of women and that task, being an airline pilot, or a group of gay men and the task of being a childminder, and people associate members of that group with not being good at a particular task in question. And so when they're confronted with a particular instance, a particular member of that group and asked to evaluate how good they are at that, it turns out they evaluate them as being bad, even though the evidence before them, the evidence of that particular individual, is it doesn't justify that conclusion. So two particularly important features of implicit bias that we should sort of flag up right from the start. Because you might think, well, there's nothing particularly, unusual about what you're talking about. We know about this. This is sexism, racism, homophobia. We're aware that these things happen in the world. We're aware that there are people who will judge people of colour negatively. There are people who will judge women negatively. There are people who judge gay people negatively. What's the sort of news here? Well, the news here is that you can have implicit biases like this, even though you're consciously and explicitly committed to equality. So even people who are sort of ardent civil rights activists or ardent feminists may nonetheless, and quite possibly will, nonetheless have these negative unconscious associations and will as a result be biased against a particular person because of their membership of the group in question. So the point is that you can't, just by being committed to equality, get over these, or so the evidence shows. People who, in lots of their actions, give you evidence that they're sort of committed to equality will nonetheless commit the sorts of biases that we see. The other noticeable feature of implicit bias is it's not just directed at groups other than the one that you belong to. So it's not just the case that it's men that are going to be biased against women and will judge women more negatively. Turns out that women are exactly as vulnerable to these biases as men. And similarly, black people will judge other black people to be poor at a particular task that they're stereotyped as being poor at, just as much as people who aren't black will do that. Okay, so these are sort of two crucial features of it that mean that sort of show that this is not just the standard forms of racism, sexism, homophobia, and so on that we're used to. There's these distinctive features about them. First of all, you may well have these biases, and indeed the statistics suggest you probably will have these biases, whichever group you belong to, and however much you will consciously and explicitly commit yourself to equality. So, what's the evidence for this sort of thing? Just a handful of some of the most striking examples. So there's a journal in the topic of behavioural ecology, inventively named Behavioural Ecology, which so in the sciences, undergraduates may not be aware of the question about anonymous refereeing at all, but in most philosophy journals now we have anonymous refereeing, so that means when the paper gets sent into the journal to see whether it's going to be published or not, the editor often will know the name of the person sending in, but when it gets sent out to the referees to decide who give the sort of reports on it, it will be anonymised, the name will be removed, so the referees shouldn't know anything about the identity of the person. So in particular, they won't know the sort of information they can get from a name, which is often facts about gender or ethnicity. So a little bit like marketing, exactly. But in sciences, that's not really the case. In sciences, they very often have non-anonymised refereeing processes. So the person's name will be given over to the referees. But one journal, Behavioural Ecology, decided to start anonymous refereeing. And at that point, or in the next year after the first round of this, it led to a 33% increase in articles authored by women. Now, there's got to be some explanation for this. It could be, one explanation for it could be that there's lots of the referees that are simply overt sexist and were rejecting articles by women because they overtly, consciously judged them to be inferior because on the grounds that they were written by women. That's a possibility, but it seems unlikely that it should be so wide, that sort of very overt sexism should be so widespread that it would give rise to that sort of increase. So the suggestion is there would be, that there may well be some unconscious mechanism in play. Okay. One of the most famous studies, one that's been replicated recently in Sweden. So a bunch of academic psychologists were sent exactly the same CV. So they were all sent exactly the same CV, except half of the CVs that went out had a female name on it, traditionally female name on it, and on the other half had a traditionally male name on it. And they were asked to evaluate it. And it turned out that both male and female members of this group, members of this group of academic psychologists, gave the male applicant better evaluations for teaching, search, service experience, and they were twice as likely to hire the male candidate as the female candidate. So this was a CV where the only difference was the name at the top of it. Every other aspect of it was exactly the same. The study was replicated recently in Sweden where traditionally white names and traditionally Arabic names were put in place of the male and female names, and the same sort of phenomenon was noted.
I did this talk in experimental psychology a few weeks ago, and they said they were talking about a prominent psychologist who was asked about what was her secret to her success. And she said, my only advice to junior women is publish under your initials. As in, just so people don't know your gender to begin with. She thought that was the key to her own academic success.
And it is sort of notable, some of the sort of most eminent female philosophers from the sort of 70s and 80s, when something was particularly bad, do exactly that, publish under those sorts of under initials. The last example I'll talk about is this this study where the people doing the study looked at references that had been written for medical students going into their first medical job. And they looked at, compared them for how much, what proportion of the reference was spent talking about particular aspects of the person's competence. So for instance, talking about their personal life, talking about their publications, talking about their CV, talking about their patients or their colleagues. And note, so the female, in references for female applicants, the reference writer spent a lot more time, I mean massively more time talking about their personal life and massively less time talking about the sort of academic part of their qualifications, like the publications and their CV. Okay, so that's implicit bias. It's a psychological mechanism. It's incredibly robustly evidenced. So this is something that's been found across all cultures and groups of people, and for all sorts of groups that are underrepresented in certain situations. So my colleagues will talk us through that.
Right, so here we find a different mechanism whereby the bias is self-directed. So if you think about particular groups of people, so the obvious stereotype here is, thrown like a girl, which is incidentally the name of a really famous essay by Iris Marion Young, who's a phenomenologist who wrote about female body experiences and one of her most famous essays called "For Like a Girl," and it's very worthy of a read. So what happens here is that the person confronts the bias and prejudice of stereotype, and that hampers their performance because they conform to the stereotype. So you can trigger stereotype threat by reminding people of their membership of a particular group or class of which has these negative associations. So if you say to female, now it's the girl's turn to throw, they'll underperform compared to if they just say, it's your turn. And similarly, very subtle cues such as walking a candidate into an interview room where the panel consists mostly of male interviewers and simply pointing out saying, oh, the ladies' bathroom is just there. That's a cue that's strong enough to trigger a stereotype threat and make women underperform in this case in an interview situation. So those very subtle ways, which again can be triggered, the ways in which stereotype threat can be triggered could be entirely without the person causing the triggering meaning to do that. So maybe the person just trying to be helpful and says, oh, the ladies' bathroom is just here, but what they've inadvertently done is reminded the woman of her membership of the group women, and then, oh, she's being interviewed for a job in philosophy of mathematics or logic, and then she underperforms in the interview. And the second is, the higher the stakes, the stronger the effect of stereotype threat. So again, if you think about an interview situation, which some of you will be coming up against quite soon, that's a very acute situation in which the stakes are very high and stereotype threat can be easily triggered. So here's an example, again from the US, of Asian girls sitting a math test. If the girl identity is made salient to them, they perform significantly worse than if the Asian identity is made salient. And again, they trigger, they make the girl identity salient by simply asking them to colour in a flower or a picture of a girl. So it's quite a subtle trigger. Another example, black and white men play golf. If they're told that they're playing to test their natural athletic ability, the white men underperform